Eleanor Whitmore stood outside the tall oak door with her hands pressed flat against her skirt, trying to stop them from shaking. She had been called to this room without warning, pulled away from the garden where she had been reading to her aunt, and told only that the Duchess wished to speak with her at once. That single sentence had been enough to turn her stomach into a tight knot. She had known, from the moment the footman found her, that this meeting could not be good news. Duchesses did not summon companions for pleasant conversation. They summoned them to give orders, or to deliver warnings. The door opened before she could knock. A servant stepped aside, and Eleanor walked into a room lined with dark wood and cold light. The Duchess sat near the window, her back straight, her eyes sharp and unreadable. She did not ask Eleanor to sit. "I will not waste your time or mine," the Duchess said. "I know my son has been seeking you out. I know he finds you amusing. What I need you to understand, Miss Whitmore, is that amusing is all you will ever be to him." Eleanor felt her face grow warm, but she kept her voice steady. "I have not asked for anything from your son, Your Grace." "No," the Duchess said, studying her carefully. "I do not think you have, which is almost worse. A woman who wants his title, I can manage. A woman who simply enjoys his company, without asking for anything at all, is far more dangerous, because my son might begin to believe he could keep her." The words landed heavier than Eleanor expected. She said nothing. "He cannot," the Duchess continued. "You understand that, don't you? Whatever this is, whatever small kindness has passed between you, it ends the moment it becomes inconvenient. And it will become inconvenient very soon." Eleanor lifted her chin. "Then I suppose we understand each other, Your Grace." The Duchess studied her a moment longer, then gave a small nod, as if satisfied, and waved a hand toward the door. Eleanor curtsied, turned, and walked out with her spine straight and her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the servants in the hallway could hear it. It was only once she reached the empty corridor, away from watching eyes, that she allowed herself to stop and press a hand against the wall. She had known, of course. She had known from the very beginning that a duke and a companion with no fortune could never be spoken of in the same sentence without scandal attached. But knowing a thing in her mind, and hearing it spoken aloud by his own mother, were two very different experiences. One was a quiet worry she could set aside, the other was a door closing. 3 weeks earlier, she had not even known his name. She had arrived in London at the start of the season as companion to her aunt, Lady Prescott, a wealthy widow with failing eyesight and a fondness for gossip. Eleanor's role was simple: to read to her aunt, to write her letters, to walk beside her at social gatherings and quietly steer her away from stairs and low furniture she could no longer see clearly. It was not a glamorous position, but it was steady, and steady was something Eleanor had learned to value above almost everything else. Her family had once had modest means, enough for a comfortable home and a proper education, but her father's sudden death had left debts no one had known about, and within a year the house was sold and the servants let go. Eleanor, at 19, had gone from a young woman expected to marry well, to a young woman expected to earn her keep. She had accepted the position with her aunt gratefully, telling herself that dignity did not depend on wealth, only on how a person carried themselves. She believed that. Mostly. The night she met Duke Alistair Camden, she had not been trying to meet anyone at all. She had been standing near the edge of a crowded ballroom, half hidden behind a large arrangement of white flowers, watching her aunt from a careful distance while the older woman spoke with old friends. Eleanor liked these moments best, the quiet in-between times at parties when no one expected anything of her and she could simply watch. A glass had slipped from a passing servant's tray, and in the small commotion that followed, someone had stepped backward directly into her, sending her stumbling against the flower table. A hand had caught her elbow before she fell. "Steady," a voice had said, low and amused. The flowers did nothing to deserve that. She had turned, expecting an apology from some careless young man, and instead found herself looking up into the calm, faintly smiling face of a man she did not recognize, though something in his bearing told her immediately that he was someone of consequence. He wore his clothes the way people wear clothes when they have never had to think about whether they could afford them. "I apologize," she had said, straightening her dress. "I should have been paying more attention." "On the contrary," he said, "I believe it was my elbow that started this entire disaster. Allow me to take the blame. It suits me better than it suits you." There had been something so easy about the way he said it, no flattery, no performance, simply a small joke offered kindly. Eleanor had laughed before she could stop herself, a short surprised sound that seemed to please him more than any practiced compliment would have. "You laugh at my jokes," he said. "That alone makes you the most interesting person I have spoken to tonight." A low bar, I imagine, for a room this full. Lower than you would believe. He had glanced around at the crowd with something like weariness. Everyone here has already decided what they will say to me before they open their mouths. It becomes very predictable after a while. And what did you decide I would say? Nothing, he admitted. That is rather the point. I had no idea who you were, which meant for one moment, I had no idea what you would say next. It was refreshing. It was only later, when her aunt found her and whispered his name and title with wide, delighted eyes, that Eleanor understood exactly who she had been speaking to. Duke Alistair Camden, one of the most sought-after men in London, heir to one of its oldest families, a man whose attention every mother in the room wanted for her daughter. Eleanor had felt a small, cold drop in her stomach at the knowledge, a warning she chose, in that moment, not to fully listen to. Over the following days, she told herself their conversation had been a passing thing, an accident of timing that would not repeat itself. But it did repeat itself. He appeared at the next gathering she attended, and the one after that, always finding some reason to stand near her, to ask her opinion on something no one else had thought to ask, to make some quiet remark meant only for her ears. She began, despite every warning in her own mind, to look forward to seeing him. It was not that he said anything improper, or made any promise he had no right to make. It was smaller than that, and somehow more dangerous. It was the way he listened when she spoke, as though her answers actually mattered to him. It was the way his easy public charm dropped away slightly when they were talking, replaced by something quieter and more honest. It was the way he remembered small details from their conversations days later, things she had mentioned only once. Eleanor was not foolish. She understood the shape of the world she lived in. Dukes did not marry companions. Companions who allowed themselves to hope for such things were usually left with nothing but a broken heart and a ruined reputation. She had watched other women make that mistake, had heard the whispered stories about them at parties, the pity and the scorn mixed together in equal measure. She had told herself, again and again, that she would not be one of those women. And yet here she was, 3 weeks later, standing outside the Duchess's door with her hands still shaking, because somewhere along the way, without quite meaning to, she had allowed herself to hope after all. Now, walking back through the quiet corridor toward the garden where her aunt was waiting, Eleanor tried to arrange her face into something calm and unreadable before anyone could see her. She would not give the household staff or the other guests or anyone at all the satisfaction of seeing how deeply the Duchess's words had struck her. But inside, something had shifted. The warning had been clear, and it had come from the one person whose opinion could not be ignored. Whatever had been growing between herself and Alistair Camden, whatever small and careful thing it had become over these past weeks, was now standing on very thin ground. She reached the garden and found her aunt sitting exactly where she had left her, fanning herself slowly in the afternoon warmth. "You were gone a long while, dear," Lady Prescott said, not looking up. "Was everything all right?" Eleanor sat down beside her, folding her hands carefully in her lap. "Everything is fine, Aunt, simply a small matter." Her aunt gave her a sideways glance, the kind that suggested she did not entirely believe this answer, but she said nothing more, and Eleanor was grateful for it. She needed a moment to think, to decide what she would do with the warning she had just been given. Across the garden, through a gap in the hedges, she caught sight of a familiar figure walking toward the house, laughing at something one of his companions had said. Alistair had not seen her yet. For a moment she simply watched him, memorizing the easy confidence in his walk, the way sunlight caught in his dark hair, wondering how much longer she would allow herself these small, quiet moments of watching before she found the strength to stop. She did not yet know that the answer to that question would arrive far sooner, and far more painfully, than she expected. That evening, after her aunt had retired to bed, Eleanor sat by the window of her small room and looked out over the darkened street below. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every thought feel louder than it should. She kept returning to the Duchess's words, turning them over like stones, searching for some crack in their certainty, some possibility she had missed. She found none. A duke's mother did not make idle threats. She made plans, and she made sure those plans were carried out. If the Duchess had decided that Eleanor was a problem to be managed, then Eleanor's time in this world of ballrooms and quiet gardens was already numbered, whether she chose to accept it gracefully or not. There was a soft knock at her door. She opened it to find one of the younger housemaids, a girl named Margaret who often brought up messages after the rest of the household had gone quiet. "A note, Miss Whitmore," Margaret whispered, glancing down the hallway before handing it over. "From the Duke himself. He asked that I bring it to you directly, and not through the usual channels." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the folded paper. She thanked the girl and closed the door before opening it, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. The handwriting was quick, almost careless, as though it had been written in a hurry. I heard you were called to see my mother today. I do not know what was said, but I can guess. Do not believe everything she tells you about what is or is not possible. Meet me in the East Garden tomorrow, before the others are awake. There are things I would rather say to you myself. Eleanor read the note twice, then a third time, before folding it carefully and pressing it against her chest. Every instinct born of caution told her to burn the paper and forget the request entirely. The Duchess's warning had been clear enough, and ignoring it so soon would be foolish beyond measure. And yet, there are things I would rather say to you myself. The words settled into her like a small, stubborn flame, refusing to be put out no matter how firmly she tried to reason with herself. She had spent 3 weeks telling herself that whatever existed between them was small and manageable, easily set aside if it ever became necessary. But sitting there in the dark, holding his handwriting in her hands, she understood with sudden clarity that it had never been small at all. She would go to the garden in the morning. She told herself it was only to end things properly, to speak the truth plainly so there could be no confusion between them afterward. She told herself many things that night, lying awake long after the candle had burned low, and she was not entirely certain, even by morning, which of them she actually believed. Eleanor woke before the sun had fully risen, her body tense with a mixture of nerves and something close to excitement she was ashamed to admit even to herself. She dressed quickly in the gray light, choosing a plain blue dress that required no help with its fastenings, and slipped out of the house through the servants' entrance before the rest of the household began to stir. The morning air was cold and sharp, carrying the smell of wet grass and early dew. She walked the familiar path toward the East Garden with quick, purposeful steps, rehearsing in her mind exactly what she would say. She would thank him for his kindness these past weeks. She would explain, calmly and without bitterness, that his mother was right, and that continuing to seek each other out would only lead to trouble for them both. She would say her piece, and leave with her dignity intact. She had the entire speech prepared by the time she reached the garden gate. She lost every word of it the moment she saw him standing beneath the old stone archway, waiting for her with an expression that was neither the polished charm he wore in public, nor the careful humor he had shown her at their first meeting, but something rawer and more uncertain than she had ever seen on his face before. "You came," he said, as though he had genuinely doubted she would. "I said I would end things properly," Eleanor replied, forcing steadiness into her voice. That seemed to require an in-person conversation. Something flickered across his face, a small wound quickly hidden. "End things. Is that truly why you're here? Your mother made her position very clear yesterday, Your Grace." "Alistair," he corrected quietly. "Please. Not here. Not this morning." Eleanor hesitated, then allowed herself the small concession. "Alistair." She made her position clear. "And she is not wrong. Whatever this has been between us, it cannot continue. You know that as well as I do." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, and made her unable to. "My mother has spent my entire life deciding what I can and cannot want," he said finally. "I have gone along with it more often than I care to admit, because it was easier than fighting her, and because until recently, nothing had ever mattered enough to make the fight worthwhile. And now? Now I find myself standing in a garden before sunrise, terrified that a woman with more sense than I have is about to walk away from me for good, and discovering that the thought of it frightens me more than anything my mother could possibly say." Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Alistair, you are a duke. I have nothing. No fortune, no name that means anything in these circles. Nothing to offer a man in your position except conversation and honesty, and those things do not build a future." "They might build a better one than fortune and name ever could," he said. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by women who wanted my title. You are the first person I have met in years who seemed entirely indifferent to it. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How much I have come to value it?" "Indifference is not the same as suitability," Eleanor said, though her voice had grown softer, less certain than before. "No," he agreed, "but it is a beginning. Give me time, Eleanor. Let me find a way through this. I am not asking you to promise me anything. I am only asking you not to disappear before I've had the chance to try." She should have said no. Every practical instinct in her told her to say no, to turn and walk back through the gate and put an end to something that could only end badly. But standing there in the pale morning light, looking at the uncertainty in his eyes, the genuine fear of losing something rather than the careless confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, she found she could not make herself say the word. "I will not disappear, uncomfortable," she said instead. "But I will not pretend this is simple either. Your mother will not change her mind, Alistair. And even if she did, there would be others. The whole of society is watching men like you, waiting to see who you choose. I cannot compete with that kind of scrutiny. Then we will be careful, he said. For now, until I find the right way to handle it. It was not a promise of marriage, not a declaration of anything permanent, and Eleanor understood that clearly even as she agreed to it. But it was enough, in that moment, to send her walking back to the house with a lightness in her chest that she had not felt in years, dangerous and foolish as she knew it to be. Over the following weeks, their meetings became a careful, quiet pattern woven into the edges of the social season. They found each other in libraries during crowded parties, when everyone else had drifted toward the music and the dancing. They exchanged brief words at garden gatherings, standing at a respectable distance that fooled no one who was truly paying attention, though most were too absorbed in their own concerns to notice a companion and a duke exchanging quiet smiles across a crowded lawn. One afternoon, a sudden storm caught them both walking separately near the same stretch of parkland, and they ended up sheltering together beneath the wide branches of an old oak tree, rain hammering down around them while they laughed at the absurdity of their situation, soaked and hidden from the world for nearly an hour. If anyone finds us like this, Eleanor said, wringing water from the edge of her sleeve, there will be no explaining it away. Let them find us then, Alistair said, though there was no real recklessness in his voice, only the easy warmth that had become familiar to her. I find I care less about that than I once did. You say that now. You will care a great deal more when your mother hears of it. My mother hears of everything eventually. I have simply decided to stop letting that stop me from living my life in the meantime. Eleanor studied him carefully, rain dripping from her hair, and felt something in her chest tighten with a mixture of hope and worry. That is easy to say beneath a tree in the rain, Alistair. It will be harder to say in front of your family, at your engagement dinners, in the rooms where these decisions are actually made. He did not answer immediately, and something in his silence told her she had touched a truth he was not yet ready to face directly. Instead, he reached over and gently brushed a strand of wet hair from her face, his fingers lingering a moment longer than necessary. I know, he said finally, quietly. I know it will be harder. I am asking you to trust that I mean to try anyway. She wanted, desperately, to believe him completely. Part of her did. But another part, the part shaped by years of watching her family's fortune disappear overnight, the part that had learned early and painfully how quickly good intentions could be overwhelmed by practical necessity, kept a small, careful distance even as her heart leaned closer. The storm passed eventually, and they walked back separately, as always, taking different paths to avoid being seen together. Eleanor returned to her aunt's house with her dress still damp and her mind full of a happiness she did not entirely trust. 2 weeks later, at a grand ball held to celebrate the engagement of one of Alistair's distant cousins, Eleanor found herself standing near the edge of the dance floor once again, watching him from a careful distance as he moved through the room, greeting guests, laughing at the appropriate moments, playing the role that was expected of him. He found her eventually, as he always seemed to, drawing her gently toward a quieter corner of the ballroom where the noise of the party faded into a low, distant hum. You look as though you would rather be anywhere else, she said. I would rather be exactly where I am, he replied, simply not surrounded by quite so many people pretending to be happy for reasons they don't actually feel. Cynical, for a man who claims to have found something worth caring about. Perhaps that is exactly why I've become cynical about everything else. He glanced around the room, then back at her, his expression growing more serious. Eleanor, I have been thinking. About us. About what comes next. Her breath caught slightly. And? I do not have an answer yet. Not a complete one. But I know that whatever I decide, I want you to be part of the deciding, not simply someone waiting on the outside for whatever I manage to arrange. It was, she would later realize, the closest he ever came to a real declaration, standing in that quiet corner with the music drifting faintly around them and the whole weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. He did not finish the thought. A cousin called his name from across the room, some obligation pulling him away before he could say anything more concrete, and the moment slipped past unfinished, the way so many important moments do, without either of them fully realizing at the time how much would depend on what was never quite said. Eleanor watched him walk away to rejoin the party, and told herself there would be other moments, other chances for the conversation to finish itself properly. She did not yet know how few of those chances remained, or how quickly the fragile, careful world they had built together in gardens and libraries, and beneath rain-soaked trees, was about to be tested in front of everyone who mattered most. She only knew, standing alone in that quiet corner, that for the first time in years, she had allowed herself to want something, without immediately preparing for the disappointment of losing it. It was, she thought, both the bravest and the most foolish thing she had done since arriving in London, and she was not yet certain which of those two truths would prove stronger in the end. Her aunt noticed the change in her before Eleanor was ready to admit it aloud. Lady Prescott, despite her failing eyesight, had never lost her sharp sense for the small details of a person's mood, the particular lightness in a step, the way a young woman's attention drifted mid-sentence toward the far side of a room. "You have been humming again," her aunt observed one evening, as Eleanor helped her into her chair by the fire. "You did not used to hum." "I was not aware I had a habit of it," Eleanor said carefully. "You did not, until recently." Lady Prescott folded her hands in her lap, her clouded eyes fixed somewhere near Eleanor's face, though Eleanor knew she could see little more than a blurred shape. "I may not see well anymore, my dear, but I am not foolish. Something has changed in you these past weeks. I would simply like to know whether I should be worried." Eleanor busied herself with the fire screen, avoiding her aunt's gaze even though the older woman could not have met it clearly regardless. "There is nothing to worry about, Aunt." Her aunt did not sound convinced. "I was young once myself, you know, though it may be difficult for you to imagine. I remember what it feels like when a person begins to matter more than they should. I remember too how it ends, when the two people involved do not occupy the same station in life." Eleanor's hands stilled on the fire screen. "You need not concern yourself, Aunt. I am careful." "Careful," Lady Prescott repeated, a note of gentle sadness in her voice. "Careful is what people say, right before they are not careful enough. I only ask that you remember, Eleanor, whatever happens, that your worth was never meant to depend on whether a man of high rank finds you worth his time. You had value before this season began, and you will have it long after, regardless of how any of this concludes." The words stayed with Eleanor long after she had settled her aunt for the night and retired to her own small room. She sat by the window again, as she so often did now, and turned her aunt's warning over in her mind alongside the Duchess's earlier one. Two very different women, speaking from two very different positions in life, yet arriving at nearly the same conclusion. It should have frightened her more than it did. Instead, she found herself thinking of the way Alistair had brushed the rain from her hair beneath the oak tree, and the fear settled into something smaller, something she could set aside for one more night. Gossip, however, does not wait politely for permission, and it was not long before whispers began to circulate through the drawing rooms and card tables of London society. Eleanor first became aware of it at a small afternoon gathering, when she overheard two young women discussing, in tones just loud enough to be certain of being heard, how curious it was that the Duke of Camden had developed such a sudden interest in poetry discussions held wherever a certain companion happened to be standing. "I hear he seeks her out quite deliberately," one of them said, not troubling to lower her voice as Eleanor passed nearby with a tray of refreshments for her aunt. "Though I cannot imagine what he sees in her. She has no fortune at all, I am told, and her family lost everything years ago." "Perhaps he simply enjoys the novelty of it," the other replied, with a small, cutting laugh. "Dukes do grow bored of the usual sort of woman eventually. It rarely lasts, of course. These things never do." Eleanor kept her expression carefully neutral and continued walking, though the words followed her long after she had left the room. She had known, in an abstract way, that people would eventually begin to notice. She had not fully prepared herself for how it would feel to hear herself discussed so casually, so dismissively, as though her entire existence were nothing more than an amusing diversion for a bored young duke. That evening she mentioned it to Alistair when they met briefly in the shadowed alcove of a music room during another crowded party, the sound of a string quartet drifting faintly through the door. "People are talking," she said quietly. "About us. I heard two women discussing it this afternoon, as though it were the most entertaining piece of gossip they had encountered all season." Alistair's jaw tightened slightly, though his voice remained calm. "Let them talk. Talk changes nothing between us." "It changes a great deal for me, Alistair. You will simply be seen as a man enjoying himself before eventually settling into a proper match. I will be seen as a fool who mistook attention for something more permanent. The consequences are not equal between us, and I think you know that." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "You are right. I have not thought enough about what this costs you, compared to what it costs me. I have been selfish, wanting your company without fully considering what it means for you to give it." "I do not regret giving it," Eleanor said softly, surprising herself with the honesty of the admission. "I only wish I understood better where it was leading." "So do I," Alistair admitted. "I wish I had a clearer answer to give you. All I know is that when I imagine the alternative, choosing the path my family expects without you anywhere in it, I find I cannot make myself want that future at all." It was not the declaration she had hoped for. not a promise she could hold on to with any real certainty. But it was honest, and in that moment, honesty felt like enough. They parted ways again, as always, slipping back into the crowd separately, and Eleanor spent the rest of the evening watching him move through the room with a strange, aching mixture of pride and dread, knowing that the quiet, careful world they had built together could not remain hidden much longer, and uncertain what would be left of it once it was finally exposed to the light. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the sort of thick, gold-edged paper that announced its own importance before a single word was read. Lady Prescott held it close to her face, squinting at the elegant script, and let out a small, delighted gasp. "The Camden family ball," she said, "the grandest event of the entire season, and we have been invited. This is a wonderful honor, Eleanor." Eleanor took the invitation from her aunt's hands and read it herself, though her stomach had already begun to sink before she finished the first line. A grand ball, hosted by the Duchess herself at the family's principal London residence, with every notable family in the city expected to attend. It was, everyone understood without needing to be told directly, the event at which Alistair's engagement would very likely be announced. She had heard the rumors circling for days now, whispered behind fans, and exchanged over afternoon tea. The Duchess had settled on a match, a young woman named Charlotte Ashford, daughter of an earl, with a fortune and a bloodline that satisfied every requirement the Camden family valued. The engagement was not yet official, but everyone spoke of it as though it were only a matter of time, a formality waiting to be announced at the proper occasion. Eleanor had not spoken to Alistair in nearly a week. Their last meeting had been brief and strained, both of them aware of the pressure building around them but neither willing to say plainly what it meant. She told herself, walking into the grand ballroom on the night of the event with her aunt on her arm, that she was prepared for whatever the evening might bring. She was not. The room was a blaze of light and color, chandeliers throwing gold across a sea of silk gowns and polished shoes, the air thick with perfume, and the low murmur of hundreds of conversations happening at once. Eleanor guided her aunt to a seat near the edge of the room, then stood quietly beside her, scanning the crowd despite every instinct telling her not to. She found him near the center of the room, standing beside his mother, and beside a young woman Eleanor recognized immediately as Charlotte Ashford, elegant and composed in a gown of pale silver, her hand resting lightly on Alistair's arm, as though she had every right to be there. Which, Eleanor reminded herself firmly, she did. Alistair's eyes found Eleanor's across the crowded room, and for one brief moment, something passed between them, an apology, a warning, she could not tell which. Then his mother said something quietly at his side, and he turned his attention back to the conversation in front of him, his expression settling into the polished, practiced charm Eleanor had seen him wear for every stranger in London, the same charm he had once told her he was tired of performing. The evening moved forward in a slow, painful procession of small moments. Eleanor watched from a distance as Alistair danced with Charlotte, as he laughed at something she said, as his mother stood nearby with an expression of quiet, satisfied approval. She told herself it meant nothing, that a man could dance with a woman without any deeper meaning attached, that appearances at an event like this were carefully managed for reasons that had nothing to do with genuine feeling. She almost believed it, until the moment everything changed. It happened near the refreshment tables, where Eleanor had gone to fetch a glass of water for her aunt, hoping the brief errand might settle the tight, anxious feeling that had been building in her chest all evening. Alistair appeared beside her, seemingly by chance, though Eleanor suspected it was not chance at all. "Eleanor," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "I need to speak with you. Not tonight. There are too many eyes here. But soon. There are things happening that I have not fully explained to you, and I owe you an explanation before. Alistair." A voice cut through the moment, sharp and pleasant in equal measure, and Eleanor turned to find Charlotte Ashford approaching, her silver gown catching the light with every step, her smile polite and entirely confident. "There you are. Your mother has been asking for you. She wants to introduce me to the Whitfield family before supper is announced." "Of course," Alistair said, and Eleanor watched something shift in his posture, a straightening, a settling into the role expected of him. "Charlotte, this is Miss Whitmore. She is companion to Lady Prescott." Eleanor waited for something more, some acknowledgement of the weeks they had spent together, the conversations, the rain-soaked afternoon beneath the oak tree, the almost declaration in the quiet corner of another ballroom. It did not come. Alistair's introduction was brief, courteous, and utterly empty, the kind of introduction one might offer for a servant passing through a room, present and forgettable in the same breath. "How nice," Charlotte said, offering Eleanor a polite, distracted smile, before turning her full attention back to Alistair. Shall we? I do not wish to keep your mother waiting. Alistair glanced at Eleanor for one brief, unbearable second, something apologetic flickering across his face, and then he allowed Charlotte to lead him away into the crowd, back toward his mother and the family duties that shaped every corner of his life. Eleanor stood alone by the refreshment table, the glass of water still in her hand, feeling as though the floor beneath her had quietly, silently given way, even though nothing around her had visibly changed at all. The music continued. The chandeliers still blazed overhead. The room was still full of laughter and conversation, and yet something fundamental had shifted. Some final piece of hope she had not fully admitted to holding had just been dismantled in the space of a single, courteous introduction. She returned to her aunt's side and delivered the water with steady hands, though her heart felt as though it had been carved hollow. Lady Prescott glanced up at her, her clouded eyes narrowing slightly with concern. "You look pale, dear. Are you unwell?" "I am simply tired, Aunt. It has been a long evening. We can leave, if you wish." Eleanor considered it for a moment. The tempting relief of escaping this room, this crowd, this careful performance of civility that had just cost her something she could not name precisely, but felt keenly nonetheless. But leaving now, hurrying away like a woman running from a wound, felt like exactly the wrong response. She had done nothing wrong. She would not behave as though she had. "No," she said finally. "I think I would like to stay a while longer." She spent the remainder of the evening moving carefully through the edges of the room, speaking politely when spoken to, smiling when smiling was expected, and watching, from a controlled distance, as Alistair continued performing his role beside Charlotte Ashford, for the benefit of every important family gathered beneath his mother's roof. She did not approach him again. She did not need to hear another careful, empty introduction to understand what she had already understood the moment his voice had gone formal and distant in front of Charlotte. It was nearly midnight when the Duchess made her way through the crowd toward the small, quiet corner where Eleanor stood watching the dancing from a safe distance. Eleanor straightened instinctively, bracing herself for whatever the older woman intended to say. "Miss Whitmore." The Duchess's voice was measured, almost gentle, which somehow made the words that followed cut deeper than anger would have. "I hope you understand now what I meant when we spoke before. My son is a good man, but he understands his duty, in the end, better than you perhaps gave him credit for." Eleanor met her gaze steadily, refusing to let the trembling in her chest reach her voice. "I understand a great deal more than I did before tonight, Your Grace. I thank you for the clarity." The Duchess studied her for a long moment, something almost like respect flickering briefly across her composed features, before she nodded once and moved back into the crowd, leaving Eleanor alone once again with the noise and light of a party that suddenly felt very far away from anything that mattered to her at all. She found her aunt near the entrance sometime later, ready at last to make their exit, and as they moved through the grand hall toward their waiting carriage, Eleanor caught one final glimpse of Alistair across the room. He was watching her, she realized, over the heads of the crowd, his expression unreadable in the dim light, and for just a moment she thought he might break away and come after her. He did not. His mother said something at his shoulder, and he turned obediently back toward the conversation in front of him, and Eleanor walked out through the tall front doors into the cool night air without looking back again, carrying with her the quiet, certain understanding that whatever had existed between them, however honest it had once felt in gardens and libraries and beneath rain-soaked branches, had just been publicly and deliberately set aside in favor of everything his family and his position demanded of him. The carriage ride home was silent. Her aunt, sensing something had shifted but wise enough not to press for details in the darkness of the enclosed carriage, simply reached over at one point and took Eleanor's hand, holding it gently for the remainder of the journey. Eleanor did not cry. She had expected to, had braced herself for the tears the entire ride home, but instead she found only a strange, hollow clarity settling over her. The quiet after a storm has finally passed through and moved on. She understood now, with a certainty she had been avoiding for weeks, exactly what kind of place she occupied in Alistair Camden's life. Beloved in private, perhaps, cherished even, in quiet gardens and empty music rooms where no one important could see, but never, under any circumstance that truly mattered, acknowledged where the world was watching. And a love that could only exist in shadows, she thought, staring out at the passing streetlights, was not truly love at all. It was only a comfortable secret, kept exactly as long as it remained convenient to keep. By the time the carriage reached her aunt's house, Eleanor had made a decision, quiet and complete, settling into her chest with a strange kind of peace. She would not wait for another humiliation to make the choice for her. She would end this herself, on her own terms, before it had the chance to break her any further than it already had. Sleep did not come easily that night. Eleanor lay awake long after the house had gone silent, replaying the moment of that brief, empty introduction over and over, searching it for some detail she might have misread, some kindness hidden beneath the formality that she had simply been too hurt to notice. She found nothing new. The memory remained exactly as painful on the 10th review as it had been on the first. Morning brought no relief. She rose early, as she always did, and went about her usual duties with a careful, mechanical precision, helping her aunt dress, arranging the morning correspondence, reading the newspaper aloud in a voice that gave away nothing of the turmoil beneath it. It was nearly noon when Margaret, the young housemaid, appeared at her door once again, this time with an expression far more hesitant than her usual cheerful manner. "A note, Miss Whitmore," she said quietly. "From the Duke. He asked that I deliver it privately, as before." Eleanor took the folded paper with steady hands, though her heart had begun pounding the moment she saw the familiar handwriting on the outside. She waited until Margaret had gone before breaking the seal. "I know what my silence last night must have looked like to you. I know what it felt like, standing there while I said nothing that mattered, while I let Charlotte lead me away as though you were no one at all to me. I have no excuse that will satisfy either of us. My mother has arranged a great deal in these past weeks, more than I fully realized until I saw it all assembled in one room last night, and I have been a coward about facing what that means for us. I ask only for the chance to explain myself properly, in person, away from every watching eye. Please, Eleanor. Meet me tomorrow, in the same garden where we first spoke honestly to one another. I will find a way to make this right, if you will simply give me the chance to try." Eleanor read the letter 3 times before setting it down on her small writing table, her emotions tangled into something she could not easily untangle. Part of her, the part that had spent 3 weeks falling slowly and helplessly for the honesty beneath his practiced charm, wanted desperately to believe that an explanation existed, some circumstance that would make sense of the previous evening's coldness and restore the warmth she had come to rely upon, far more than she had ever intended to. But another part of her, older and more guarded, shaped by years of watching promises dissolve under the weight of practical necessity, recognized the letter for what it likely was, not a solution, but a delay. Not a change of course, but a request for more time to keep 2 incompatible paths running alongside each other for just a little while longer. She thought of her aunt's quiet warning, spoken weeks earlier by the fire. She had value before this season began, and she would have it long after, regardless of how any of this concluded. She thought, too, of the Duchess's measured, almost gentle cruelty at the ball, the certainty in her voice that duty would always, eventually, win out over sentiment where her son was concerned. Eleanor folded the letter carefully and placed it in the small wooden box where she kept the few personal items she owned, uncertain even as she did it whether she was preserving it out of sentiment or simply postponing the decision of what to do with it. She did not answer that day. She told herself she needed time to think, though in truth, she suspected she already knew what her answer would be, and was simply gathering the courage to speak it plainly. That evening, her aunt asked, gently, whether something had happened at the ball the previous night. The Duke seemed rather occupied with Miss Ashford, Lady Prescott observed carefully, folding her hands in her lap. "I heard the whispers, even with my poor hearing. It seems the engagement will be announced any day now." "Yes," Eleanor said quietly. "I imagine it will." Her aunt was silent for a long moment, studying her niece's face with whatever clarity her clouded eyes could still manage. "I will not pretend to know exactly what has passed between you and that young man, Eleanor. But I have watched you these past weeks, and I have watched you these past 2 days, and the difference is not subtle. Whatever decision you are turning over in your mind, I trust you to make it with the good sense you have always shown. You are stronger than you believe yourself to be right now." The words settled over Eleanor like a quiet blessing, and for the first time since the ball, she felt something loosen slightly in her chest, some small space opening where she could finally begin to think clearly, instead of simply feeling the sharp edges of her own hurt. She thought of the garden Alistair had asked her to meet him in, the same quiet place where 3 weeks earlier he had asked her not to disappear before he'd had a chance to try. She thought of his handwriting, hurried and honest, asking once again for time, for patience, for one more chance to make sense of a situation that grew more tangled with every passing day. By the time she finally extinguished her candle that night, Eleanor had decided she would go. Not because she believed an explanation would change anything, but because she owed herself, and perhaps even owed him, one final honest conversation before she closed this particular chapter of her life for good. She did not yet know exactly what she intended to say, but she knew, with a calm certainty that surprised her, that whatever words she chose, they would be the last ones she ever spoke to Alistair Camden, as anything more than a stranger passing briefly and painfully through her life. The garden was exactly as she remembered it, quiet and gray in the early morning light, dew still clinging to the grass beneath the old stone archway. Eleanor arrived a few minutes early this time, wanting the space to gather herself before he appeared, wanting to stand once more in the place where everything had begun, and feel, clearly and completely, everything it had come to mean before she said goodbye to it. Alistair was already there when she rounded the final hedge, pacing slowly near the fountain with his hands clasped behind his back, his expression tense in a way she had rarely seen on him before. He looked up the moment he heard her footsteps, and something in his face eased slightly with relief, though the tension did not leave him entirely. "You came," he said, echoing the same words he had spoken weeks earlier, though his voice carried none of the earlier lightness. "I said I would," Eleanor replied, stopping a careful distance away from him. "I keep my promises, even when I am uncertain whether I should." He winced slightly at that, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the only sound the quiet trickle of water from the fountain and the distant call of a bird somewhere beyond the hedges. "I owe you an explanation," he said finally, "about last night." "You do not owe me an explanation, Alistair. You owe yourself an honest look at what happened, and perhaps you owe your mother a conversation about what she is arranging on your behalf. But you do not owe me anything. I was never entitled to any part of your life you were not willing to give freely." "That is not fair to either of us," he said, taking a step closer. "I was not free with you last night because I was afraid, Eleanor. Afraid of what my mother would do, afraid of the consequences to my family, afraid of losing everything I have been raised my entire life to protect. That fear does not excuse how I treated you, but it explains it at least, and I would rather you understand the truth of it than believe I simply did not care." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she believed him completely. That was, perhaps, the most painful part of all. This was not a man who had never cared. It was a man who cared deeply, and had still chosen, when the moment truly mattered, to protect everything else in his life above her. "I believe you were afraid," she said quietly. "I do not doubt that for a moment. But Alistair, fear that controls your actions is still a choice. You chose, last night, to introduce me as though I were nothing more than a passing acquaintance, while your mother stood beside a woman she has already chosen for you, and I understand why you made that choice. I even sympathize with the position you are in. But I cannot build any part of my future around a man who will always, when it truly matters, choose the comfortable path over the honest one. Give me time," he said, and there was real desperation creeping into his voice now, a crack in the composed exterior he usually wore so easily. "I am not asking you to accept things exactly as they stand. I am asking for the chance to find a way through this, to speak with my mother properly, to make her understand that Charlotte is not the future I want for myself. And how long will that take, Alistair? Another week? Another season? How many more balls will I stand at the edge of, watching you perform a role you claim not to want, while I wait quietly in the shadows for a moment that may never actually arrive?" He had no answer for that. He opened his mouth as though to speak, then closed it again, and the silence between them stretched out long enough that Eleanor understood, with a quiet and settling clarity, that she already had the only answer she truly needed. "I have been thinking a great deal these past 2 days," she said, keeping her voice steady even as something in her chest ached with the effort of it, "about what I actually want, and about what I am willing to accept in order to have some piece of you in my life. And I have realized something important, Alistair. I do not simply want to be loved quietly, in gardens and libraries where no one important can see. I want to be acknowledged. I want to matter in the rooms that count, not only in the corners where it costs nothing to care about me. And you cannot give me that. Not because you do not want to. I believe that you do, in your own way. But because you have spent your entire life being taught that duty comes first, and I do not believe, no matter how much time I give you, that lesson is one you will ever fully unlearn." "That is not fair," he said quietly, though there was little real conviction left in his protest. "Perhaps not," Eleanor agreed. "Very little about this situation has been fair, to either of us. But fairness is not the same as truth, and I think we both know, standing here right now, which one of those two things actually matters." Alistair took another step toward her, close enough now that she could see the genuine distress in his eyes, the particular kind of pain that comes from watching something slip away and understanding, too late, exactly how much you are about to lose. "Please," he said, his voice low, "do not decide this now, not like this, not in anger." "I am not angry, Alistair," and she realized, saying it aloud, that it was true. The sharp, wounded anger she had carried out of the ballroom 2 nights earlier had settled, over the quiet hours of thinking and waiting, into something calmer and far more certain. "I am simply clear. for the first time in weeks, about what I need to do. I care for you. I do not think that will change quickly, no matter how firmly I wish it might. But caring for someone is not enough, on its own, to build a life around, especially when that life would require me to remain permanently hidden, waiting for a moment of courage that I no longer believe is coming. It is coming, he said. I swear to you, Eleanor, I mean to find a way through this. I hope you do, she said, and she meant it sincerely, even as her heart broke quietly with the saying of it. I hope you find the courage to want something for yourself, rather than simply accepting what has already been decided for you. But I cannot wait beside you while you search for it. I have spent too long already believing that patience and quiet hope would eventually be enough, and last night taught me, quite clearly, that they will not be. She reached up and unfastened the small silver pin from her collar, the one he had given her weeks earlier after finding it discarded and forgotten at a market stall. A small, unremarkable thing that had somehow become precious to her over the following days. She held it out to him, and after a long moment, he took it from her hand, his fingers brushing briefly against hers, a touch that felt, in that moment, like the ending of everything. I will not forget these past weeks, she said quietly. I do not regret them, whatever comes next. But I think it is time for both of us to stop pretending that quiet meetings in gardens can substitute for an honest life lived in the open. You deserve the chance to choose your own path, Alistair, whatever that path turns out to be. And I deserve the same chance, one that does not require me to remain invisible in order to have a place in it. He said her name once, quietly, a small, broken sound that nearly undid the calm she had worked so hard to maintain. But she had already made her decision, somewhere in the long, sleepless hours of the previous 2 nights, and she found, standing there in the pale morning light, that she had the strength to see it through. Eleanor stepped back, straightened her spine, and offered him a curtsy, slow and perfectly correct, exactly the gesture a woman of no particular rank owed to a duke, nothing more and nothing less than propriety demanded. It was, she understood even as she performed it, the most deliberate thing she had ever done. Every other moment between them had blurred the careful lines society expected them to maintain. This single formal gesture restored those lines completely, drawing them back into their proper places, a companion and a duke, exactly as the world had always insisted they must remain. Your Grace, she said, her voice steady and clear, I wish you every happiness. Then she turned and walked away, back through the hedges, back toward the gate, back toward the ordinary life waiting for her beyond this quiet garden, without once looking back to see the expression on his face. Alistair stood beneath the old stone archway for a long time after she had gone, the small silver pin still clutched in his hand, watching the empty space where she had disappeared, as though he expected, at any moment, for her to change her mind and return. She did not return. The garden remained quiet and still around him, the fountain trickling on exactly as it had before, entirely indifferent to the fact that something important had just ended within its walls. It did not fully occur to him, standing there in the morning light, that the curtsy she had given him was not a beginning of some new, more careful chapter between them, a polite pause before eventually finding their way back to each other. It was, though he would not understand this fully until much later, the precise and deliberate closing of a door, performed with such perfect correctness that he mistook its formality for hope, when in truth, it had been her final, dignified goodbye. He returned to the house nearly an hour later, still turning the small silver pin over in his fingers, and found his mother already awake, taking her morning tea in the sitting room that overlooked the front gardens. She glanced up as he entered, her sharp eyes immediately noting something unsettled in his expression. You have been out early, the Duchess observed, setting down her cup with quiet precision. Walking, I assume. Thinking, Alistair corrected, moving to stand near the window rather than sitting across from her as he usually did. About Miss Ashford, I hope. The engagement announcement cannot be delayed indefinitely, Alistair. People are already speculating, and speculation left unanswered too long tends to curdle into something far less flattering than a proper announcement would. About Eleanor, he said, and watched his mother's expression tighten immediately at the name. She ended things between us this morning. Formally. Completely. The Duchess was quiet for a moment, studying her son with an expression that mixed relief and something more careful underneath it. I am sorry for whatever pain that has caused you, she said finally, and to her credit, she sounded as though she meant it, at least partially. But you must understand, Alistair, that this outcome was always the only sensible one available to us. The young woman clearly possessed more good sense than either of us gave her credit for. She possessed more courage than I did, Alistair said quietly, still staring out at the garden below. That is what I cannot stop thinking about. She walked away from everything she might have wanted, on her own terms, because she refused to accept less than she deserved. I have spent my entire life accepting whatever was arranged for me, telling myself it was simply the price of my position. I am beginning to wonder whether that was ever truly necessary, or whether I simply lacked the nerve to ask if things might be different. His mother said nothing for a long moment, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had softened slightly, though it retained its familiar firmness. Whatever you are feeling now, it will pass, Alistair. These things always do. You will marry Charlotte, and in time, you will build a life together that is perfectly comfortable, even happy, in its own way. Most marriages of our kind are built on far less than what you and Miss Ashford already share. Comfortable, Alistair repeated, the word tasting strange and hollow in his mouth. Yes, I imagine it will be exactly that. He did not argue further, not that morning. There would be time, he told himself, to sort through everything he was feeling, to decide what, if anything, he intended to do about it. For now, he simply excused himself and retreated to his study, closing the door quietly behind him, and sat for a long while at his desk with the small silver pin resting on the polished wood in front of him, saying nothing to anyone, thinking of a curtsy performed with perfect, devastating correctness in a quiet garden that had once felt like the only honest place in his entire carefully arranged life. Eleanor, meanwhile, walked back to her aunt's house with a steadiness that surprised her, given how thoroughly her chest ached with every step. She had expected, somehow, to feel shattered after finally saying the words aloud, after watching him standing beneath the archway with that broken, pleading expression on his face. Instead, she felt strangely clear, as though a fog she had been living inside for weeks had finally lifted, leaving the world around her sharper and more solid than it had felt in a very long time. She found her aunt waiting in the morning room, and though Eleanor said nothing about where she had been, Lady Prescott seemed to understand regardless, studying her niece's composed face with quiet, careful attention. "It is finished, then," her aunt said gently. It was not quite a question. "It is finished," Eleanor confirmed, settling into the chair across from her with a calm she did not entirely feel, but was determined to hold on to regardless. "Are you well?" Eleanor considered the question honestly before answering. "I believe I will be. Not today. Perhaps not even this month. But I made the choice myself, Aunt, rather than waiting for it to be made for me. And there is a strange kind of comfort in that, even now." Her aunt reached over and patted her hand gently. "That is the beginning of wisdom, my dear. Choosing your own ending, rather than accepting whatever ending is handed to you. It took me far longer than your age to learn that particular lesson. I am glad you have learned it so much sooner than I did." Eleanor managed a small, genuine smile at that, the first she had felt in days. "What happens now, do you think?" "Now," her aunt said, straightening slightly in her chair, "we finish out the season properly, with our heads held high, and then we consider what comes next for you. Entirely on your own terms this time. You are a capable, clever young woman, Eleanor. This household has never truly needed a companion so much as it has needed your company, and I suspect there are opportunities in this world for a woman of your abilities that neither of us have fully considered yet." Eleanor did not have an answer for that, not yet. But she found, sitting there in the quiet morning room with her aunt's hand resting warmly over her own, that for the first time in weeks, she was able to think about her own future, without immediately measuring it against the shape of a life she would never actually be allowed to have. 6 months passed, and London society moved on exactly as Eleanor had known it would, with the easy forgetfulness of a world that had countless small dramas to entertain it, and little patience for dwelling on any single one for very long. The engagement between Alistair Camden and Charlotte Ashford was announced within a fortnight of that quiet morning in the garden, celebrated with a grand dinner that half the city seemed to attend, and by the time autumn arrived, the wedding itself had been held with all the elaborate ceremony expected of two of London's most prominent families joining together. Eleanor did not attend. She had left her aunt's household by then, though not entirely, having accepted a new position that Lady Prescott herself had helped arrange, working as an assistant to a respected woman who ran a small publishing house, specializing in educational books for young readers. It was not the life anyone might have predicted for her at the start of the season, but it was steady, honest work that used her mind rather than simply her patience, and Eleanor found, to her quiet surprise, that she enjoyed it more than she had ever enjoyed the careful performances of the social season. She thought of Alistair less often than she might have expected, though never quite not at all. Some memories refused to fade entirely, no matter how firmly a person tried to set them aside. The particular sound of his laugh, the way he used to remember small details from conversations days after she had mentioned them, the rain-soaked afternoon beneath the old oak tree, when for one brief, foolish hour, The entire world outside their small shelter had seemed to disappear completely. She did not regret the memories. She had decided, early on, that regret would serve no useful purpose, and that the weeks she had spent with him, however they had ultimately ended, had taught her something valuable about her own worth that she might not have learned any other way. She had learned, most importantly, that she was capable of walking away from something she wanted deeply, when staying would have required her to accept less than she deserved. That lesson, once learned, did not disappear simply because the source of it had married someone else. Alistair's life, meanwhile, unfolded exactly as his mother had predicted, though not quite in the way the Duchess had imagined it would feel from the inside. His marriage to Charlotte was, by every outward measure, a success. She was intelligent, capable, well-suited to the demands of managing a great household, and entirely comfortable in the role society had prepared her for since birth. They were seen together at every important gathering, presented themselves as a united and contented couple, and no one outside the family ever suspected that anything at all was missing from the arrangement. But Alistair knew. He knew it most sharply in the quiet moments between social obligations, when the house had gone still and Charlotte had retired for the evening, and he found himself sitting alone in his study with the small silver pin still resting in the drawer of his desk, exactly where he had placed it 6 months earlier, and had never quite found the resolve to remove. He tried, more than once, to convince himself the feeling would fade with time, that his mother had been right, that comfort and companionship would eventually settle into something that resembled happiness closely enough not to matter. And in many ways, it did settle into something comfortable. Charlotte was a good partner, thoughtful in her own way, and Alistair was not so foolish as to believe his marriage was without its own genuine warmth. But comfort, he had come to understand slowly and painfully over those 6 months, was not the same thing as the particular alive, honest feeling he had known only briefly, in gardens and libraries and beneath a rain-soaked oak tree, with a woman who had wanted nothing from him except his honesty. He heard news of Eleanor occasionally, filtered through the same social channels that had once carried gossip about the two of them together. He heard she had left her aunt's household. He heard she had taken a position with a publishing house, a piece of information that struck him as entirely fitting, given how often she had spoken, during their brief weeks together, about her love of books, and her frustration at never having the resources to pursue anything beyond reading them for other people's benefit. He was glad, genuinely glad, that she had found something that suited her so well. The gladness did not make the accompanying ache any smaller. One evening, nearly 8 months after their final meeting in the garden, Alistair attended a small literary gathering hosted by a friend of his mother's, the sort of quiet event he rarely bothered attending, but had agreed to out of politeness after Charlotte had expressed interest in the discussion planned for the evening. He had not expected, walking into the modest drawing room filled with writers and publishers rather than the usual crowd of nobility, to see Eleanor standing near the far wall, deep in conversation with an older gentleman about a manuscript he assumed she had been reviewing for her employer. She looked well. That was his first thought, sharp and immediate, cutting through the polite composure he had spent months carefully building around any thought of her. She looked settled in a way he had not seen during their brief time together, confident in a manner that suggested she had found, in this new life, exactly the kind of place in the world she had once told him she wanted, a place where she mattered in the rooms that counted, not merely in quiet corners where it cost nothing to care about her. She saw him a moment later, and for one brief instant, something flickered across her face, surprise perhaps, or the ghost of old feelings stirred unexpectedly to the surface. But it passed quickly, replaced by a composed, polite expression that gave nothing away, and she offered him a small, correct nod from across the room, the exact acknowledgement one might offer a distant acquaintance, before turning her attention back to the conversation in front of her. Alistair did not approach her. He understood, watching her from across the room, that whatever right he might once have had to walk over and speak with her freely had ended entirely on that quiet morning in the garden, and that showing up now, uninvited, in the middle of her new life, would serve no purpose except to disturb a peace she had clearly worked hard to build for herself. Charlotte, standing beside him, followed his gaze briefly, then glanced up at his face with the particular sharp attentiveness she brought to most things. "You know Miss Whitmore?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. "We were acquainted briefly, during my final season before our engagement," Alistair said, keeping his own voice equally neutral, though something in his chest tightened with the effort of it. "She was companion to Lady Prescott." "She seems to have done well for herself since," Charlotte observed, watching Eleanor with mild curiosity rather than any real suspicion. "I have heard good things about the publishing house she works for. Quite progressive, from what people say." "Yes," Alistair agreed quietly. I imagine she has done very well indeed. He spent the rest of the evening participating in the discussion around him with the appearance of full attention, laughing at appropriate moments, offering thoughtful comments on the topics being debated, playing the role that had become, over the past 8 months, almost second nature to him. But some part of his attention remained fixed on the far corner of the room, tracking Eleanor's movements without appearing to do so directly, watching the easy confidence with which she spoke, the genuine warmth in her laugh when something amused her, the complete absence of the careful, guarded caution that had always shadowed her expressions during the weeks they had spent together, hiding in gardens and libraries from a world that had never truly welcomed her presence at his side. She had built, he realized, watching her from across that crowded room, exactly the kind of life she had once told him she needed, a life where she was seen, where her opinions carried weight, where she did not need to remain hidden in order to have a place worth occupying. She had achieved it entirely on her own, without his help, without his title, without any of the protection or position he might once have offered her, had he found the courage to offer it when it still mattered. The gathering ended eventually, and Alistair and Charlotte made their way out into the cool evening air, climbing into their waiting carriage for the ride home. Charlotte settled beside him, already discussing some detail of the evening's conversation, her voice warm and familiar in the enclosed space. Alistair listened, responded when appropriate, and found himself, as he so often did now, thinking of a small silver pin resting in the drawer of his study desk, and a curtsy performed with perfect, deliberate correctness in a garden he had not visited since. He understood now, with a clarity that had taken him far too long to reach, exactly what that curtsy had meant. It had not been a pause, a temporary formality, before eventually finding their way back to each other, as he had foolishly allowed himself to believe in the weeks immediately following. It had been an ending, complete and final, offered with a dignity he had not fully deserved, from a woman who had understood, long before he did, that some choices could not be delayed indefinitely, without eventually making themselves permanent regardless. She had walked away from a duke, from a title, from every advantage his position might have offered her, because she had refused to accept a life lived only in the shadows of his convenience. And in doing so, she had built something far more valuable than anything he could have given her, a life entirely her own, shaped by her own choices, answerable to no one's expectations but her own. Alistair had kept his title. He had kept his family's approval, his mother's satisfaction, the comfortable, well-arranged marriage that had been planned for him since before he had ever met Eleanor Whitmore in a crowded ballroom on an ordinary evening that had turned out, in the end, to be anything but ordinary. He had kept everything he had been raised to protect. He had simply never quite managed to keep the one thing that had made him feel, however briefly, like a man rather than merely a position waiting to be filled. And riding home through the quiet London streets beside a wife who deserved better than a husband, still thinking of another woman's curtsy, Alistair understood, at last, and far too late to change it, exactly what he had lost the moment he let her walk away. Eleanor, for her part, walked home that same evening, with a lightness in her step that surprised even her. Seeing him again, after so many months apart, had stirred something in her chest she had not fully expected, a brief, sharp reminder of feelings she had believed thoroughly settled. But standing there across the crowded room, watching him nod politely in her direction before turning back to his wife's side, she had realized, with quiet satisfaction, that the ache she felt was not longing for what might have been. It was simply the ordinary tenderness a person carries for a meaningful chapter of their past, present but no longer sharp enough to wound. She thought about it more carefully as she walked, the cool evening air settling pleasantly against her skin after the warmth of the crowded drawing room. She had built, over these past 8 months, a life that fit her far better than she had ever expected the world to offer a woman in her position. Her work at the publishing house had grown steadily more substantial, her opinions sought after by colleagues who valued her judgment rather than merely tolerating her presence. She had made friends of her own choosing, formed connections built on genuine respect rather than careful social calculation, and found, in the process, a version of herself she had not fully known existed before circumstances forced her to discover it. She reached the small, comfortable set of rooms she now shared with a fellow employee of the publishing house, a cheerful, sharp-minded young woman named Beatrice who had become, over the months, something close to a true friend. Beatrice was awake when Eleanor arrived, curled in a chair near the fire with a manuscript in her lap, and looked up with immediate curiosity. "How was the gathering?" Beatrice asked. "Did the great literary minds of London manage to say anything worth repeating?" "A few interesting things," Eleanor said, settling into the chair across from her friend and beginning to unpin her hair, though the most interesting part of the evening had nothing to do with literature at all. Beatrice raised an eyebrow. sensing immediately that there was more to the story. Go on then. I can see you are bursting to tell me. Eleanor smiled faintly, surprised at how easily the words came, how little weight they carried compared to how heavily this same subject would have sat upon her only months earlier. I saw the Duke of Camden there, with his wife. We spoke briefly, or rather, we did not speak at all beyond a polite nod across the room. It was the first time I had seen him since the season ended. And? Beatrice asked gently, setting her manuscript aside entirely now, giving Eleanor her full attention. And I felt something, seeing him, Eleanor admitted. A small ache, the sort you might feel remembering an old friend who moved away long ago. But nothing more than that. No regret, no wishing things had turned out differently. I looked at him standing there with his wife, playing the role that has been prepared for him since birth, and I found myself feeling rather sorry for him, in a strange way. He has everything he was raised to want, and I do not think, watching his face tonight, that it has brought him nearly as much peace as he once hoped it would. And you? Beatrice asked. Are you at peace? Eleanor considered the question seriously before answering, turning it over the way she had learned to turn over every important question these past months, weighing it honestly rather than reaching for the easiest available answer. I believe I am, she said finally, more than I expected to be. Certainly more than I was, during those weeks when I still believed some version of happiness required his acknowledgement to feel complete. I learned something important, walking away from that garden all those months ago. I learned that my worth was never something another person could grant me or take away, no matter how much power or position they held. I had simply forgotten that truth for a little while, distracted by the particular warmth of being noticed by someone the whole world seemed to want. Beatrice reached over and squeezed her hand warmly. For what it is worth, Eleanor, I think you made the braver choice. Most women in your position would have stayed, would have accepted whatever small hidden place they were offered, simply grateful for the attention of a man with a title. You wanted more than that. You still want more than that. I admire it more than I have ever properly told you. Eleanor felt her eyes grow unexpectedly warm at the words, and she squeezed her friend's hand in return, grateful beyond measure for the quiet, steady companionship that had grown between them over these past months. A friendship built on mutual respect rather than the careful, unequal dynamics that had shaped so much of her previous life. Later that night, lying awake in her own small, comfortable room, Eleanor thought once more of the garden, of the curtsy she had offered beneath the old stone archway, of the quiet certainty that had settled over her in the moment she turned and walked away without looking back. She did not regret that decision, not even slightly, not even now, seeing him again, and feeling the brief echo of old feelings stir briefly within her chest. She had chosen herself, that morning, over the uncertain promise of a future that would have required her to remain forever hidden, forever grateful for scraps of acknowledgement offered only when it was safe and convenient to offer them. She had walked away from a duke, and in doing so, had walked directly toward a life entirely her own, built on her own terms, answerable to no one's expectations but her own quiet, steady sense of what she deserved. It had not been an easy choice. It had cost her something real, in those first difficult weeks after the garden, a genuine grief, for what might have been under different, kinder circumstances. But standing on the other side of that grief now, 8 months later, with a life she had built herself stretching comfortably around her, Eleanor understood completely that it had also been the right choice, the only choice that could have led her here, to this quiet room, this steady friendship, this hard-won and entirely genuine peace. Somewhere across the city, in a grand house she would never enter again, a duke sat alone with a small silver pin in his hand, understanding at last exactly what he had lost the moment he let her walk away. Eleanor, meanwhile, closed her eyes and drifted toward sleep, with no such regret weighing upon her at all, only the quiet, settled satisfaction of a woman who had curtsied once, correctly and completely, and then walked forward into a life entirely her own.